the grief and the comfort. The house felt emptier than ever. The walls, once echoing with laughter and quiet conversations, now stood as silent witnesses to Emma Carter's grief. It had been 6 months since Mark passed, yet the void he left felt no smaller. Nights stretched endlessly, and mornings brought no relief. She had read somewhere that grief dulls over time, but for her, it remained sharp, a constant ache she carried in her chest. Emma sat on the couch, staring at the framed photograph on the mantel. Mark's smile was frozen in time, a painful reminder of what she had lost. She reached for her tea, now cold, just as a knock sounded at the door. She sighed, setting the mug aside before rising. "Emma." Daniel Reed's voice was gentle, careful. He had a way of speaking as if afraid to break something fragile. She opened the door to find her neighbor standing there, holding a brown paper bag. His familiar, easy smile softened the weight in her chest. "I thought you might need something warm," he said, lifting the bag slightly. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon drifted toward her. A small, tired smile touched Emma's lips. "You didn't have to." "I know," he replied, stepping inside as she moved aside. "But I wanted to." Daniel had been a constant presence in her life ever since Mark's funeral. Where others had gradually faded, offering well-meaning condolences before returning to their lives, Daniel had remained. He checked in, ran errands, fixed the loose porch step Mark had always meant to get to. At first, Emma resisted his help, unwilling to accept the kindness. But loneliness had a way of wearing down defenses, and Daniel, persistent yet unobtrusive, had found a way through. She took the bag from him and peeked inside. "Cinnamon rolls. You once mentioned they were your favorite," he said, his smile growing. "Figured they might make the morning a little easier." The gesture warmed her, and she gestured toward the kitchen. "Coffee's still warm. Stay." He nodded, following her in. They fell into an easy rhythm. Daniel leaned against the counter as she set 2 mugs on the table. Their conversations were simple, filled with unspoken understanding. He never pried, never forced her to speak about Mark unless she wanted to. Instead, he spoke about small things, his work, the neighborhood gossip, mundane details of life that made her feel connected to the world again. Halfway through her second cinnamon roll, Emma found herself laughing at a story about Daniel's disastrous attempt to fix his garbage disposal. "And then," he grinned, shaking his head, "water shot straight up, soaked me head to toe." Sophia walked in at that exact moment and just stood there, shaking her head. "Call a plumber, Daniel," she said. "You are not the handyman you think you are." Emma smiled, though at the mention of Sophia, a subtle tension settled between them. Daniel's wife was a presence more in name than in reality. A corporate job kept her away for long stretches, and even when she was home, it seemed their schedules rarely aligned. Emma had never asked, but she noticed the way Daniel avoided certain topics, the way his smile dimmed when conversations veered too close to his marriage. A crack of thunder rumbled outside, making Emma glance toward the window. Dark clouds gathered, heavy with rain. "Looks like a storm's rolling in." Daniel followed her gaze. "Yeah. You okay alone tonight?" The question, though casual, sent a flicker of something unreadable through Emma's chest. "I'll be fine," she said. "Storms don't bother me." He hesitated. "Still. If you need anything, just call." She nodded, feeling the weight of his concern. For a moment, she wondered what it would be like if she let herself lean a little more on him, if she allowed the comfort he so readily offered. But she pushed the thought away before it could settle. As Daniel finished his coffee and stood to leave, he paused by the door. "Take care, Emma." "You too, Daniel." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving her alone once more. Yet, as she stood there, staring at the empty space where he had been, the house didn't feel quite as silent as before. She exhaled, retreating to the couch. Outside, the wind howled, rain tapping against the windowpane. Emma pulled a blanket over her shoulders, but even as she closed her eyes, she knew sleep wouldn't come easily tonight. Not with the lingering warmth of Daniel's presence still hanging in the air. The line crossed. The storm that night had been brief, but the turbulence it left behind lingered in Emma's mind long after the rain had stopped. She told herself that Daniel's concern was nothing more than neighborly kindness, but the way he had looked at her before leaving, like he wanted to say something but thought better of it, made it harder to believe. Days passed, yet something had shifted between them. Daniel still dropped by, still checked in, but there was a difference in the way they spoke, in the pauses that stretched between words. Emma felt it in the way his gaze lingered a fraction longer than necessary, in the way their conversations felt heavier with something unspoken. One afternoon, as she tended to the small garden Mark had once cherished, Daniel appeared at the fence separating their properties. His sleeves were rolled up, his expression easy, but his eyes held something deeper. "Need a hand?" he asked, resting an arm on the wooden post. Emma wiped the sweat from her brow, smiling. "I think I've got it, but I won't say no to company." He stepped through the gate, crouching beside her. They worked in silence for a while, the warmth of the sun casting long shadows across the yard. At one point, their hands brushed against the same spade, and neither moved away immediately. Emma swallowed, pretending not to notice the way her pulse quickened. "You don't talk about her much," she said suddenly, surprising even herself. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "Sophia?" She nodded. He exhaled, leaning back on his heels. "There isn't much to say." Emma glanced at him, waiting. "She's busy," he admitted after a pause. "Always has been. At first, I admired it. She was driven, ambitious. But somewhere along the way I guess I realized that I didn't fit into her plans the way I thought I did." Emma listened, her fingers absently tracing patterns in the soil. Daniel shook his head. "I'm not saying she's a bad person. She just prioritizes things differently." There was something almost vulnerable in his voice, something Emma wasn't sure she had the strength to ignore. Later that evening, as she prepared dinner, her phone buzzed. "Daniel, feel like a walk?" She hesitated, then typed back, "Sure. Meet you out front." The evening air was crisp, the scent of damp earth still lingering from the storm. They walked side by side, their steps unhurried. At first, they spoke about nothing. Neighborhood gossip, books Emma had been reading, an old dog Daniel had once owned. But as the quiet between them stretched, the weight of everything unsaid pressed down. At the small park near their street, they stopped by a bench. The lamplight cast a soft glow around them, making the world feel smaller, more intimate. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I think about you, Emma." The words sent a jolt through her. She turned to him, her heart pounding. "Daniel." "I know," he interrupted. "I know it's wrong. I know we shouldn't." She should have shut it down then. She should have told him to leave, to go home to his wife. But she didn't. Instead, she whispered, "Then why does it feel inevitable?" His hand found hers, his fingers warm against her skin. Emma knew that if she let this happen, there would be no going back. But in that moment, with the night wrapping around them and Daniel looking at her as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered, she didn't care. The kiss was slow, hesitant at first. But when neither pulled away, it deepened, months of buried longing rising between them. The world faded, leaving only the press of lips, the racing of her heart, the feeling of being wanted. When they finally broke apart, breathless, reality crashed in. Daniel's expression was unreadable. "Emma, I don't," she whispered, stepping back. "Not yet." She turned, walking home alone, her mind a tangle of guilt and longing. The line had been crossed. And there was no undoing it now. The consequences and the unexpected truth. The days that followed were a blur of contradictions. Emma told herself it had been a mistake, that the kiss, the stolen moment under the streetlight, had been nothing more than grief twisting itself into something unrecognizable. And yet, when Daniel knocked at her door 2 nights later, she let him in without hesitation. They didn't speak as he stepped inside, but the silence between them was charged. Emma felt the weight of his gaze as he closed the door, and for the first time in months, the loneliness that had clung to her since Mark's passing felt bearable. But comfort had a cost. It wasn't long before Olivia noticed. "You're different," Olivia said one afternoon, setting down her coffee with a thud. Her eyes narrowed, sharp and knowing. "What's going on?" Emma stiffened, stirring her tea. "Nothing. Don't lie to me." Olivia folded her arms. "It's him, isn't it? Daniel." The words hit like a slap, though Emma had no right to be surprised. Olivia had always been perceptive, always able to see what Emma wished she could hide. Emma swallowed, staring into her cup. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." A beat of silence stretched between them before Emma finally exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. "It just happened." Olivia leaned forward, her expression tight. "And what happens when Sophia comes home?" The question landed like a stone in Emma's chest. She had spent so much time caught up in Daniel, his touch, his voice, the way he made her feel seen, that she had ignored the inevitable. Sophia wasn't gone forever. She would return, and then what? That answer came sooner than expected. Sophia arrived home on a Sunday evening, her car pulling into the driveway as Emma watched from her window. Daniel had warned her that morning, his voice strained. "She's back. We should be careful." Careful. The word felt hollow now. There had never been anything careful about this. Emma expected things to change, for Daniel to pull away, to regret what they had done. Instead, he acted as if nothing had happened, waving to her from across the fence the next afternoon as he helped Sophia unload her luggage. A cold knot twisted in Emma's stomach. The next time Olivia visited, she didn't hold back. "You need to end this," she said firmly. "Before it gets worse." Emma hesitated, but deep down, she knew Olivia was right. She had spent weeks wrapped up in Daniel, but at the end of the day, she was nothing more than an escape for him, a moment of solace in a life he refused to change. That night, Emma sent a message. "We need to talk." Daniel arrived at her door not long after. He stepped inside, but before he could speak, Emma crossed her arms. "This needs to stop." His jaw tightened. "Emma." "No," she cut him off. "This was a mistake. And you know it." Silence. Then, after a long pause, he sighed. "I care about you." The words should have meant something. Once they would have. But now they felt empty. "And yet you're still with her," Emma said quietly. "You never planned to leave, did you?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. Emma took a step back. "I deserve more than this." She expected him to fight, to try and convince her otherwise. Instead, he simply nodded. "I'm sorry." And just like that, it was over. As Daniel walked out the door, Emma felt the weight in her chest lift. It wasn't instant. The pain of losing him, even if he had never truly been hers, would linger. But she had made her choice. She had chosen herself. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.